My name is Am Johal with the Vancity Office of Community Engagement here with the SFU Woodward's Cultural Unit. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're on unceded Coast Salish territory. Welcome to the talk tonight by Christian Parenti. I'm also happy to announce this partnership with the SFU Woodward's Cultural Unit, the Vancity Office of Community Engagement, the Department of English, and the People's Co-op Bookstore. And copies of Christian's book, Tropic of Chaos, are also available for sale outside the cinema, and he'll be available to sign the book as well. Here to introduce Christian and also to moderate the discussion is Dr. Jeff Dirksen. He's a cultural critic and poet who works in Vancouver at SFU in the Department of English. His critical writings on globalization and culture, urbanism, and art have been published extensively in North America and Europe. He's author of numerous books of poetry and a book recently, Annihilated Time. He's also part of the research group, Urban Subjects. I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Dirksen.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. I also want to particularly thank Derek O'Keefe and the Green Left Book Club for initiating the invitation to invite Christian here tonight. And also to extend a big thanks to People's Co-op Books, which is one of the most important spaces in the city. I think it's really great to have them on board as well. And thanks, too, to the people from the SFU Cultural Unit, and especially the folks who are staying overtime here and setting things up. Really appreciate it. And thanks to coming out to a critical public talk in our rapidly privatizing university space. I think it's important that these types of talks happen in these types of spaces. Otherwise, we'd be squeezed out of the university space almost entirely. So it's good to keep things public always in this sense. So tonight, Christian Parenti comes to us from Brooklyn, from Greenpoint, which I think is the most polluted area of Brooklyn, actually, unfortunately. And he's currently working at Brooklyn College, and he's held several academic positions. For me, one of the most interesting things I know that Christian's been involved in is to be a fellow at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at City University of New York, where we worked together for several years there under the great academic and social generosity of Neil Smith, actually. Christian was just saying to me that how Neil's insistence on the production of nature and the construction of nature was something that Christian kept in mind as he was writing this book. Also, I want to point out that Christian's previous books, particularly, my favorite amongst them still remains Lockdown America, which is a great analysis of the prison system in the U.S., and a book that followed after that called The Soft Cage, which is a critique and analysis of the history and spatiality of surveillance in North America, particularly America. And then the book that, sort of, in a sense, turned him into a critical journalist when he went to Iraq to investigate the invasion of Iraq, with that book called The Freedom. All of these books, and particularly this book, Tropic of Chaos, which I'll talk about tonight, take a kind of geopolitical and political economic angle of analysis and of critique. So I think that's something that makes his work stand out. He's published numerous articles in magazines, and has kind of forged, I think, a left critical space within North American discourse, something that we need even more of. So we'll have a question and answer after Christian talks, and I think Ben West, who's the climate campaigner for the Wilderness Committee, will open that up with a few thoughts and perhaps some questions. And so I'd just like to ask you to join me in welcoming Christian Parenti.
Thank you for coming out on a Friday night, and thank you to Derek O'Keefe for getting the ball rolling at the bookstore, and the whole SFU set of institutions that brought this together. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. So this book, Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence, is the thesis of the book in a nutshell is that climate change doesn't just look like extreme weather and melting ice caps. It also looks like religious warfare, ethnic warfare, civil war, mass migration, counterinsurgency. And that climate change, in other words, is already driving violence. This is not just something that may happen in the future if we don't deal with climate change, or may happen in the future when the worst effects kick in. It's actually already underway. And I think it's going to be, in many ways, the primary social fallout from anthropogenic climate change. And the idea for the book came to me to some extent when I was in Afghanistan researching the poppy trade, the opium trade from which heroin comes. And as you probably know, Afghanistan produces more than 90% of the world's heroin. And I was doing, I did a series of stories, the first one in 2004, and always in different places over the years, talking with farmers, one reason they gave for why they grew poppy rather than wheat or other crops was that it was very drought resistant. And at first, I didn't even know there was a drought in Afghanistan. And it turns out the worst drought in living memory has coincided with the whole NATO occupation of Afghanistan. And poppy uses 1/6 the amount of water that wheat uses. And in this war, there are two positions on poppy. The Karzai government and NATO attack poppy. In reality, the eradication squads eradicate very little poppy, but what eradication campaigns become is another place and mechanism whereby the kleptocracy that is the Karzai regime can extort and shake down and threaten small farmers. So, and NATO supports this idea that poppy is part of the problem and that should be destroyed. The Taliban, on the other hand, defend the farmer's right to grow poppy. And there's some confusion about that because for a while the Taliban experimented with anti-drug campaigns when they were in government, and for 1 year they banned growing poppy. But for the most part, they tolerated the growing poppy and the production of opium. And as an insurgency, they have supported the farmers and defended the farmers' right to grow poppy. So it occurred to me that along with all of the ethnic and religious motivations that a young man in Afghanistan might have for joining the Taliban and fighting these infidel invaders, there was also this economic motivation which had a root in this drought, which is connected to climate change. I mean, to be clear, it's hard. Scientists are very careful about not blaming any single weather event on climate change, though they're getting more bold about that. And not just bold, they're getting more clarity on how, and better measurements on how much of extreme weather can actually be ascribed to climate change. But one thing is very clear. There's a pattern that has been predicted by climate science for more than 20 years, and it is coming to fruition, and it involves increased desertification, increased drought in Central Asia, and that's playing out, and this 10-year drought clearly seems to be part of that. So, along with all the ethnic and religious motivations, there's this issue of, poppy is the only crop that under these drought conditions is economically feasible. It's the only way farmers can survive under these extreme climatic conditions. And the Taliban are the side in the war that support their right to do this, to survive in this fashion. So it's not that the war is caused by climate change or even that climate change is a primary driver in the war in Afghanistan, but just that it is a contributing factor. And so I thought that if there was a climatological aspect to the conflict in Afghanistan, that I'll bet that there was already climatological aspects readily apparent if one went and looked for them. And sure enough, there are. Hold on. Speaking of drought, I get cotton mouth here. The book opens in the Horn of Africa in Kenya, where a pastoralist with the Turkana people had been killed the afternoon before, and he's lying there dead at my feet. He's been killed in a cattle raid, and I tried to unpack, why was this guy killed? And that's where the story begins. And basically, what's going on in northwest Kenya and throughout the Horn of Africa is that cattle raiding, which is a traditional part of the culture and economy there, is becoming increasingly violent. And over the last 15 to 10 years, it's become really, really violence to the point where the Kenyan police, the paramilitary police, are constantly running counterinsurgency operations, essentially, against armed pastoralists. The Ugandan army has crossed the Kenyan border and bombed pastoralists from the air. The casualties in these raids reach into the hundreds over the course of a few months. In single raids, sometimes they're that high. I mean, you might remember that about 3 months ago there was a major cattle raid in southern Sudan in which 600 people were killed. So this raiding has gotten to the point where it's really intercommunal warfare. And that's how this guy, Ekuru Lorman, had been killed in a raid like that. So I tried to unpack what were the causes of this. So first of all, the landscape is in profound crisis because, like Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa is suffering one of the worst droughts it's seen in a long time, the worst drought in 60 years, which is really an intensification of the drought cycle. And in the Turkana region, all of the trees have died. It's illegal to burn the trees into charcoal, but they're so desiccated that the women are burning them into charcoal. They go to the roads and sell this charcoal to the truckers going in and out of Sudan, and the authorities do nothing about it because there's no other way for the Turkana to survive. The herds are getting sick, not having enough to eat, and the herds decline. And so to replenish these herds and survive, the young men go out and raid their neighbors. Or the herds congregate around water holes, so there's fights over who controls these water holes. And the weapon of choice is AK-47s. And there are many, many AK-47s, and there's lots of cheap ammunition. But there's also RPG rocket launchers and just huge amounts of weaponry. What there isn't any support from the state. There is no real planning. There's no real economic intervention in any way from the Kenyan state other than the Kenyan state's participation in the international aid agency's famine response machinery. But there's nothing like a reasonable, rational response to this profound drought. So why is that? All these things came together and explained why this guy, Ekuru Lorman, was killed. What happened was a neighboring tribe, he was at a watering hole close to his people's traditional enemies. And so they came down out of the Karasok Hills, the Pokot, and they tried to steal Ekuru's cattle, and there was this big gunfight, and 6 people were killed. The Pokot came around and took their cattle, and the Turkana ran and blocked them. And so, the first question then is, this drought is clearly linked to climate change. Maybe you can't ascribe it only to that, but it fits the pattern again. Where do these guns come from? Well, they're a legacy of the Cold War. Why is the state so weak? Why does it have no response? That's a legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring. And again, as I traveled across the global south, I saw this combination of 3 forces again and again. The legacy of Cold War militarism combining with the legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring, that is to say, the ideology of radical free market economic restructuring, which has mandated that the state withdraw itself from the management of and planning of the capitalist economy and wither away, as it were, that these are the 2 crises that have set the global south, have set the stage for crisis. And now onto this comes climate change in the form of extreme weather. And I call this combination of these 3 factors the catastrophic convergence. And it works differently in different places. But in terms of how exactly, and it has specific histories in different places. So the specific history in northwest Kenya begins sort of with the Cold War. The reason that the Horn of Africa is flooded with guns that fuel numerous conflicts is in part because the collapse of Uganda briefly. Idi Amin was building a huge army. He was supported in that project by the great powers, by the West. His regime collapsed when he made war on socialist Tanzania. The armories were looted. But the real crisis was the collapse of Somalia. Well, how did Somalia collapse? It began with a coup d'etat in 1969. A dictator comes to power named Said Barre, who declares himself a scientific socialist. He declares scientific socialism compatible with Islam and the pastoralist lifestyle. By the early 70s, the Cubans are in Africa supporting socialist regimes. And they have arrived in Africa and dragged the Soviets with them through their relationship to Angola. And what happens in Angola is there's a coup d'etat of progressive officers again in Portugal against the what was essentially a kind of Catholic fascist regime there, and they abruptly withdraw from colonial Africa. Their colonial project of Portugal is wrapped up. And in Angola, there's a race for who will control Angola. The MPLA, which is the party that is still in power in Angola, was at that time a Marxist party. And there was an invasion by South Africa, backed by the CIA. 2 columns of white mercenaries came in to try and oust the MPLA on the eve of independence. So Fidel Castro, totally on his own initiative, sent a group of special forces to help defend Luanda and help the MPLA, and then supported them with regular troops. And this was a resounding victory for African independence, for socialism, and a serious defeat for white supremacy in Africa and for the whole project, the imperial project in Africa. I mean, when Soweto, so these 2 columns are sent out of Africa, out of Angola, and when Soweto explodes in '76, the kids are all saying Angola, Angola. So out of this project, which in many ways is a very positive story. I mean, who's on the side of white mercenaries and CIA operatives trying to crush African independence movements? Out of this comes this project that Fidel sort of drags the Soviets in, because he doesn't ask permission to do this. He announces to them that Cuban troops are in Angola helping the revolution, and he hopes the Soviets will help them. So they start supporting more and more of these projects, including Said Barre. Said Barre, unfortunately, is more than anything a Somali irredentist, and so he has begun a secret war into Ethiopia against the trying to reclaim the only region of the Somali homeland that has not become part of Somalia. And this war it goes on to this day. This is the Ogden War. In 1974, there's also a socialist coup in Ethiopia, and then the Cubans and Soviets go in and are helping Ethiopia as well. And when it becomes apparent to Said Barre that his allies are supporting his enemies, this secret war blows up into an overt war with regular forces, and he kicks the Soviets and the Cubans out of Somalia, switches sides, and the Carter administration begins pouring in millions of dollars of aid and weapons. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan help. And so, to be fair, neither Jimmy Carter nor Fidel Castro thought that this project was going to end the way it does. But it ends this war between Ethiopia and Somalia, funded on either side by the great camps of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and its allies and the US and its allies, ends in January 1991 with the total collapse of the Somali army and with it the Somalian state. And there hasn't been a state there or law and order since. And the region, the country has hemorrhaged weapons out into the region. And that's where the guns that killed Ekru Lorman came from. They're a direct legacy of the Cold War. And so across the Global South, the legacy of the Cold War is that it has littered the landscape with cheap weapons, littered the landscape with bands of armed men who are trained in the arts of smuggling and assassination and guerrilla tactics. And the other aspect is neoliberalism, as I mentioned. And so since the early 90s, Kenya has been embracing this reduction of state participation. So that's how this kind of set of forces plays out in a fairly underdeveloped economy. And you can see that it leads to very sort of direct and clear and simple resource conflicts. Fights over cattle, fights over water holes. But even in more industrialized economies, you can see how these various forces play out. So a good example of that is Kyrgyzstan, which might not be that important to Canadians. It certainly doesn't get much press in the US, but if you live there, it's an important place, and it's actually quite important to the region, Kyrgyzstan. And you may recall that in the early spring of 2010, there was an explosion of ethnic violence in Kyrgyzstan between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. And one government fell, another government came in, the capital Bishkek went up in flames, and there were these pogroms between these two communities. Hundreds, thousands of Uzbek refugees tried to get into Uzbekistan, and the new government actually asked for the Russians to intervene, and the Russians very wisely declined. Things have simmered down. But the way it was portrayed in the media was just sort of ethnic hatreds boiling over again. But if you look at the deeper causes, this is what was going on. Kyrgyzstan gets 90% of its electricity from hydroelectric, particularly this one large dam, the Toktala Dam, built by the Soviets. The same drought that has been punishing Afghanistan had caused the water levels in the Toktala Dam to drop to their lowest level ever recorded by 2005. In response to that, the government started rationing power. Now, before this, of course, Kyrgyzstan had undergone vicious shock therapy with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The two-thirds of the economy was privatized. Kyrgyzstan became a highly unequal society. 40% of the population live on like $2 a day. Very, dismal economic situation to begin with. So in response to this drought, there's not enough energy. The government starts rationing power. That means industry has to start rationing its use of power, starts laying people off, unemployment goes up. The privatization program, because it had been so unpopular, had actually stalled out. Then in the winter of 2008, 2009, there comes this extreme cold snap, and people are like literally freezing to death in their apartments. The pipes are bursting, cattle herds are freezing on the hillsides. The entire economy, basically, of Kyrgyzstan shuts down for 2 months. Nothing except essential services operate. So that further damages the economy. Then coming out into end of 2009 into 2010, the government decides that it's going to re-engage this neoliberal program of privatization, and that the asset that it is going to begin with is the power company and the power lines. And so to make this infrastructure more attractive, they double the price of electricity with a promise to at least double it again. So it's actually in response to all of that people hit the streets protesting the crisis, the economic crisis, the cost of electricity, the lack of opportunity, the unemployment. And then that crisis devolves into these ethnic conflicts because the crisis itself had produced these pools of lumpenized young men who can't go to college, don't have jobs, spend their times drinking and hanging out in casinos in their ethnic communities, building animosities towards each other. And so they hijack what was really a kind of broad-based, class-based protest and turn it into this ethnic violence. So underneath the ethnic violence is an economic crisis. And underneath the economic crisis is this environmental crisis that, if not completely blamable on climate change, is linked to it and fits the pattern that's been described by scientists for decades. So that's an example of how this causality can work even in a more industrialized economy and society, and how a crisis in natural systems can play out at the scale of a city as an ethnic and political crisis. I then went on to India to look at what was going on there. And as many of you probably know, India, along with being the world's largest democracy, has one of the oldest civil wars going on. And it began in 1969-68 after a massacre in the village of Naxalbari in West Bengal, which is in the sort of northeast of India. And in response to this, a group of Maoist parties formed guerrilla armies, and they're broadly known as the Naxalites, and they have united and split apart these different parties in different combinations. And for most of the last 40 years, they were kind of contained up in West Bengal. But in the last 10 years, they have been making significant advances down the eastern Ghats, which is the mountain range, the eastern mountain range in India, down the east coast of India. And if you lay a map of the Naxalite progression south over a map of drought-affected districts, it's almost the same thing. And the red corridor is also the drought corridor. So I wanted to explore what the link was, if there was any, between Naxalitism and drought. And so I went to northern Andhra Pradesh, and what I found was that the connection works through the credit system and through genetically modified cotton, and that the primary culprit in the instability there, along with climate change, isn't so much Cold War militarism, but rather economic neoliberalism. So the Indian government began liberalizing its economy in 1991. This has been associated with high rates of growth, with the rise of a billionaire class in India. But in the countryside, it has meant increased immiseration, and overall it's meant increased inequality in the country. And the farmers, in the face of this drought, find that they have fewer and fewer of these sort of old semi-socialist programs available to them those programs had been the hallmark of Congress rule in India. So crucially in this, there's no place for them to get credit cheaply. So they turn to the private moneylenders. And they do this because of the drought. The drought means their crops fail. They can't sell anything, so they need money for next year, so they go to the moneylenders. The moneylenders won't lend them money for food crops. They will only advance money for cotton. And the reason is that you can't eat cotton. So, in an emergency, the farmers cannot steal the collateral from the moneylenders. They have to sell the cotton because it's of no use to them otherwise. So, and the moneylenders are only interested in money. That for a variety of reasons, one of them being the environmental crisis, they're not interested in accumulating land, they just want money. So the worse the drought, the more the farmers go into debt, the deeper in debt they are, the more they sell cotton, the more they have to borrow, the more they borrow, the more cotton there is, the less the price, and down it goes. To the point where farmers are so desperate that many of them are committing suicide. Across India, 200,000 farmers have killed themselves. In Andhra Pradesh, at least 2,000 farmers have committed suicide in the face of debt. And the way they do it typically is by drinking the pesticides that are applied to this Monsanto-licensed GMO cotton, which is a poetic statement of a sort. I can't imagine a more horrific way of dying. But, farmers don't just commit suicide. Some of them prepare and are ready to commit political homicide. And so into this drought-rooted crisis that's exacerbated by the state's withdrawal of any supports for the farmers and the oppression of the moneylenders, into this situation come the Naxalites. And they say, we have a short-term solution and we have a long-term solution for your problem. The long-term solution is we're going to struggle for socialism in India and a glorious future. The short-term solution is when the moneylenders come back to the village, we're going to stop his cart, we're going to kill him. And when the cops come to investigate, we're going to ambush them and keep them out of the village and fight them off. And so you can imagine if you're a farmer who's contemplating drinking pesticides to escape your plight, you might, even if you don't buy the whole Maoist vision of the future for India, you might be pretty attracted to their short-term solution, which is just fighting back and killing the moneylenders and ambushing the cops. And so people support the Naxalites. And the state's response, unfortunately, has not been to rethink neoliberalism, not rethink its withdrawal of support for small farmers, but to beef up its capacity for counterinsurgency. In Andhra Pradesh, they developed a sort of new special forces within their state police, called the Greyhounds. It's kind of like counterinsurgency and death squad combined. They don't wear uniforms. They travel in these small groups, combing the countryside, trying to analyze the Naxalite networks and killing the key links between the Naxalites and the villages, and occasionally getting into firefights with the Naxalites, and always blaming their assassinations of people on encounters. They say, well, we ran into these guys in the bush and there was a firefight, but really a lot of what they're doing is just assassinating people, and they've actually been kind of effective in Andhra Pradesh. Just north of Andhra Pradesh, another very, very dangerous and problematic response from the state in its counterinsurgency campaign in Chhattisgarh is to set up private paramilitary auxiliaries, the Salva Judum. And they are right now, under the control of the state. But really what the state is doing is seeding the landscape with future warlords, future gangsters. It's very hard for a government to roll up organizations like that once they have begun. We saw this in Colombia, where the paramilitaries begin as sort of auxiliaries and allies of the military, and then become a power unto themselves, and with the civil patrols to some extent in Guatemala. So in response to this instability generated in large part by the combination of neoliberalism and climate change, the state's military response is only exacerbating the fundamental problems of more guns on the landscape, more people committed to and trained in killing, more trauma, more deracinated, uprooted populations. So that's how it works in India. And I'm not going to get too much into this, but the way that actually Afghanistan and India and Pakistan all connect, there's a climatological aspect. And this relationship. For those of you who are unaware, Pakistan has been supporting the Taliban from the beginning. The Taliban are in many ways kind of, an element of the Taliban is a mercenary army that is trying to destabilize Afghanistan. And Pakistan has used Pashtun irregulars to destabilize Afghanistan since the mid-70s, regardless of the ideology of the government of Afghanistan. And Pakistan does this because it has actually very legitimate security concerns vis-a-vis India, against which it has fought and generally lost 4 wars. And the policy elites and the military and intelligence elites in Pakistan see Afghanistan as a pro-Indian state, which it generally has been. And so that since the mid-1970s, when Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who is he's head of one of the 3 groups that are loosely called the Taliban. You have the Taliban run out of the Quetta Shura, that's the old government of the Taliban, and you have Hezbollah Islami, which is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's party, and you have the Haqqani network. And those are the main sort of components of the insurgency in Afghanistan. Hekmatyar got his start before the socialist, the communist coup d'etat in Afghanistan in 1978. He was driven out of the country by a nationalist president named Daoud and got military support from Pakistan in the early 70s, mid-74. So Pakistan destabilizes Afghanistan because it feels threatened by India. Part of it why it feels threatened by India, I mean, there's many, many reasons it feels threatened by India. But increasingly, part of why it feels threatened by India is that 90% of the irrigation water in Pakistan is provided by the Indus River system. And India's army occupies most of the glaciers that feed the Indus River system. And increasingly, with the realization of what climate change means, elites in Pakistan and political and religious activists and militants are aware of this and very, very worried about Indian control over the headwaters of the Indus. And there's a treaty that's been in effect for quite a long time and working, but increasingly this Indus Water Treaty is breaking down. And India is building, it's not clear because a lot of it's secret, numerous dams upstream. Pakistani militants, such as the Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a sort of Pakistan Taliban group that's outlawed, its political wing, the JUD, is increasingly talking about water and climate as a security issue. And so they say that India better release water, or, at their exact terms is that water flows or blood flows. And they talk about India's water terrorism and its bellicose dam building. So that's another example of how that region has, it's not reducible to, by any means, climate change, but you can see how increasingly the environmental crisis and climate change is turning up the heat on these pre-existing crises. So then moving to the Americas, I have a chapter on Brazil. I look at the way that the drug war is linked to environmental crisis in northeast Brazil. But I think more interesting for our purposes is the situation in Mexico. The violence in northern Mexico is again, not driven primarily by climate change, but increasingly there's an element of that. Mexico is suffering some of the worst drought in 60 years, punctuated by freak flooding. Tabasco has been massively flooded twice in the last decade. So I went to Juarez wondering if I would find climate refugees. And sure enough, it's easy to find people who have been forced to move by extreme weather. So one guy I profiled was a fisherman in Michoacan. And in the late 1990s, in the late 1990s, an El Nino event caused a red tide bloom and a toxic algae bloom drove all the fish away. He fell into debt. Due to neoliberalism, due to NAFTA, there was very little state support for him to fall back on. The Mexican state had privatized its parastatal companies that sort of managed the fisheries, and he had to go into debt to private banks. He lost his gear. He migrates north, eventually gets into the U.S., but then he's deported from the U.S. And when I met him, he was in Juarez trying to figure out how he could come up with the money to hire a coyote to get across the militarized Mexico-U.S. border, because he had a job waiting for him as a roofer if he could get $3,000 to get back into the U.S. And he was saying, the only way I can do that is to get involved in the drug violence here, in the drug trade, and I really don't want to do that. But I can't go home and be a fisherman, and I don't know what else to do. And so, I found other examples of that as well. Tarahumara Indians who had moved off the land because it became so dry, and they had trouble farming and had turned to forestry to make up for the deficiencies in their farming, cut down a lot of the trees, forced to move to Juarez in the same situation, finding it difficult to survive without participating in the drug violence to some extent. The drug violence has other causes of its own, but it is increasingly, in other words, fueled by the fact that there are people being pushed off the land by environmental crisis, and particularly young men who find themselves in these cities who want and need money get sucked up into the violence. So then, on the other side of the border, you see the response of the global north. And part of what I argue in the book is that, if climate change in the global south looks like state breakdown, civil war, religious war, in the global north, it looks very different, but you can also see climate violence. And so the most obvious example is border militarization. Border militarization is a project that began in the mid-1990s, early 1990s. It's not driven primarily by climate change, but increasingly the xenophobic right in the U.S. articulates its anti-immigrant agenda in environmental terms. There's the main anti-immigrant oral lobby in the U.S. is FAIR, the Federation of American Immigration Reform. They have links to sort of white nationalist movements. They have also, FAIR has links to a group called Progressives for Immigration Reform, which is reaching out to environmentalists and trying to make an explicitly environmental case for repressive policies towards immigrants, to support border militarization, and not just border militarization, but increased police repression of immigrants and of U.S. citizens in the U.S. in the name of keeping people out of the U.S. And they talk about the carrying capacity of the United States, which, if you think about it, is an utterly ridiculous way to think of anything. The carrying capacity of the United States. I mean, what's the carrying capacity? How can you even use those terms? As if this is an island and we're talking about the number of goats that could live on it without destroying the grass or something. I mean, the United States is a massive globalized economy, and it does not have distinct boundaries that would allow you to use something like carrying capacity as a meaningful notion. It's part of the global economy. But they invoke this idea of carrying capacity and population is a concern, and therefore immigration must be halted into the U.S. And so they support stuff like Arizona's bill SB 1070, which required that police stop anyone who they suspected was an undocumented migrant. It didn't allow them to do this or empower them to do this. It required them to do this. And it gave citizens the right to sue police officers that they thought were not following this law. There's been copycat laws like that in Georgia and Alabama and elsewhere. And so, you see this developing. It's nascent, it's just incipient, but increasingly that xenophobic right in the Southwest understands itself and its project in increasingly environmental terms. And if you go to a place like Phoenix or Las Vegas, you can see why. It's very clear that these cities are based on basically building the city. That's the main business. It's based on borrowed water. All of that is running out, and everyone is acutely aware of the environmental limits they face, and they're turning on immigrants. And so, that means there's political support for increased border militarization. So we're trying now in the United States to get to having 40,000 Border Patrol agents. We have over 20,000 now, and they're hiring. The Border Patrol has what would be one of the largest air forces in the world if it were its own country. Of the 1,900-mile border, 700 miles of it are totally locked down with metal and cement fencing that's sometimes as high as 17 feet high. There are frequently 3 different kinds of motion sensors in the desert to catch people. And the parts of the border that are not walled off and fully militarized are such remote and rugged bits of desert that they're really, really foreboding, and they are essentially walls in of themselves. And they're policed by National Guard helicopters and the Border Patrol. So, and this translates into a population of undocumented immigrants who are not charged with any kind of criminal crime. They're charged with a civil crime of being in violation of immigration laws who are held in these largely privatized detention facilities. And on any given night, there are about 30,000 undocumented migrants held in these largely unsupervised, privatized detention facilities where there is tremendous abuse. Just a caveat about that. Sometimes the whole private prison question gets misrepresented on the left. We get the impression that most prisons are privatized, that this is driving the buildup. It's not true. There's really not that much use of private prisons in terms of state prisons. But in terms of immigration detention, which is where private incarceration began under Reagan, there is a lot of private participation, and most of those beds are actually private. So that's an example of climate violence already in the global north. And the other example is that the military is increasingly responding to this problem in military terms. The Pentagon, the U.S. Armed Services, take seriously the science that is published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's body that collates and vets and makes science available for policymakers. They take that very seriously, and they have published numerous studies that see climate change as a threat multiplier. And what they predict for the future is not so much an increase in conventional-style interstate warfare over resources, but rather an increase in civil war and social breakdown, internal crises into which they realize the American Armed Services are going to be called increasingly. And so they are developing a response to this and preparations for this, which essentially look like open-ended counterinsurgency on a global scale. Counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. And you can see how this is playing out already with the drones programs, the use of advisory missions and select special forces missions. And it's this military posture that the U.S. is developing, or has developed, of ongoing, open-ended counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, isn't described very often as linked to climate change, but it is. In these key planning documents, you can see that they are explicit about the role of climate change in creating a world that is unraveling and how the mission of the U.S. military is going to have to be to keep a militarized lid on that for the next coming decades. But in the more specific examples, climate falls out of the discussion. But it's there. And here's an example that's not in the book because it happened as this book was going to bed. But the Arab Spring, which is in many ways kind of a misnomer. The Arab Revolt, I guess, is a better term for it. Why did that happen last year? Why not a couple years ago? Why not a couple years from now? Who knows? But one reason, I think, is that in 2010 to 2011, we saw the second food shock of the decade. There had been a surge in food prices in 2007, 2008. But in 2010, 2011, grain prices almost doubled. Wheat went up, I think it was 83% from June 2010 to June 2011. Corn went up 91%. Why is this? It has to do with flooding and drought in Australia, flooding in the Canadian and American Midwest, and drought in other parts of the U.S., and very, very crucially, the worst drought in 100 years in the Black Sea region, which has hammered wheat production in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, all major wheat exporters. It got so bad that Glencore, which is the second largest commodity trading firm in the world after Cargill, and Glencore is actually run by a fugitive from U.S. law named Mark Rich, and he was a fugitive from U.S. law in the Clinton era, and he disappeared to Switzerland, and he began this massive commodity trading company, Glencore. Glencore was openly lobbying the Russians to stop grain exports, to ban all grain exports in the face of this drought. Russia did that. Glencore got a wonderful bounce in the price of wheat and had a very profitable IPO on the back of that. But it had serious impacts from everyone who was importing wheat. So Russia's always in the top 5 wheat exporters. Who's the single largest wheat importer in the world? Egypt. And Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, all heavily dependent on imported wheat. And you can go back and see that some of the first protests and demands were about the price of food in Libya and Tunisia and Egypt. And the last thing Ben Ali did in Tunisia before he fled was promise to lower the price of food. So it's not that the Arab Revolt is about climate change or reducible to climate change, but it seems to me that climate change and drought, particularly this Black Sea drought, causing a doubling in basic food prices, had some trigger effect. And I should say that the average Egyptian spends 40% of their wages on food. During that year, food inflation was running at 20%. So this has produced, hopefully, a process of democratization in many countries, but it also produced 3 wars, right? The war in Libya, something like a war in Syria, and for a while there, a war in Yemen, where Islamist bands have taken over key towns. That conflict seems to have cooled out now. But what was the U.S. response? Forward deployment of drones to Ethiopia, participation in the NATO-led war in Libya. So that's not described as climate war, but in a way it is, to some extent. And it's a harbinger of how conflicts will play out in the future if we don't deal with the underlying issues and if we don't try and adapt to the amount of climate change we're locked in for with something other than militarism. And to the credit of most of these militaries that study this, the US military, I'm sure the Canadian military has done these studies too, to their credit, they generally end their studies by saying, we can keep a lid on this for, 20, 30 years, but if politicians don't come up with appropriate policies to move away from the use of fossil fuels, eventually this problem will become so intense that there'll be nothing we can do. And that realization is more than you can say for a lot of the political class, at least in the US. So I try and end the book on a positive note. I was joking at first. I felt so bad. It was when first published, giving it to people, and I was joking, cyanide tablets not included, sorry. But there is actually, reason to be hopeful. It's not like we haven't invented the technologies we need to mitigate carbon emissions, to move away from greenhouse gas emissions. We have invented solar panels, windmills, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not like there isn't enough money. There's tons of money. Corporate America is sitting on more uninvested cash than at any time since 1956, according to the Federal Reserve. And I'm not talking about the profits that are paid out. I'm not talking about bonuses. I'm talking about operating capital that corporate America has and is not investing in facilities and plants. They're just parking it in short-term treasury bonds. So there's tons of money to be put to use for this transition if there's the appropriate policies to force it. And there's a couple things that can happen in the United States, which is the primary problem in many ways globally in terms of dealing with climate change. The U.S.'s refusal to take this seriously as the largest economy in the world is, I think, the heart of the problem. So even though we have a Republican Party that has drifted so far to the right that they literally don't believe in science anymore, and I mean, this is true. That's not an exaggeration. Michelle Bachmann famously said that she didn't believe that the immunization against human papillomavirus virus. She's rejecting the basic science of immunization. This is what the candidates for the nomination are saying, and none of them accept climate change as a reality. So nonetheless, there's a lot that can be done. First of all, the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S. has the obligation to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So during the first 2 years of the Obama administration, there was this fight to pass comprehensive climate legislation. It failed, and a lot of it would have been really bad had it passed. The fact of the matter is we don't need enabling legislation because we already have it. It's the 1970 Clean Air Act. And when the U.S., when Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol and it was not ratified by the U.S. Senate, green groups sued the EPA saying, under the Clean Air Act, you are already obliged to regulate these gases because they are harmful to human health, and that's your mission. This fight took 10 years. In 2007, the Supreme Court said, yes, these green groups are correct. The EPA is obligated to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The Bush administration just ignored this. The Obama administration seemed like it was going to take this seriously. He appointed Lisa Jackson to head of the EPA. She is somebody that environmentalists generally respect, that she takes these issues seriously. She has a fairly decent history behind her. But she has not been able to promulgate these regulations. And we're waiting for about 30 rules to be issued from the EPA. If these rules regulating greenhouse gas emissions were issued in a robust fashion, it would essentially impose a de facto carbon tax on the economy. So utility would still be free to burn filthy coal, but they would have to pay a really high fine for doing that. That would raise the price of the electricity they sold from burning coal, and it would therefore make other cleanly generated electricity much more competitive. So that's something that could happen, it should happen, and it's not happening because Obama refuses to take this issue seriously because of his belief that swing voters in swing states will reject him if he acts on the environment. Another thing that can happen is that the federal government and the state governments in the United States constitute 33% of the U.S. GDP. Now, this is something that the left refuses to talk about, mainly because the right talks about it all the time. Grover Norquist, who is the champion of the anti-tax movement, who has this pledge that he's gotten every member of the House and Senate, every Republican member of the House and Senate to sign. They pledge they will not raise taxes under any circumstances. One of his talking points is that the federal government is really, really big. The federal government has gotten to be 25, 26% of the U.S. economy. It's actually bigger than that. If you throw in the state, and not counting the transfers from federal government to states, it's actually over 1/3 of the U.S. economy. But the left doesn't talk about this. But we should, because that's a tremendous asset. The federal government has the largest single fleet of buildings in the U.S. Has like 450,000, mostly very large office buildings. All of them consume electricity. If the federal government committed itself to buying clean electricity, that would do a lot. It would, one, help reduce the carbon footprint of a large part of the U.S. economy, but it would have very positive knock-on effects of creating markets for the clean tech sector, which is currently hampered by not having markets. I interviewed the one electric vehicle manufacturer in the U.S., an electric truck company, and the CEO said that if he could buy components in batches of 100 rather than batches of 5 or 10, in many cases he could lower his costs by 25 to 30%. And if he could do that, his trucks would be competitive with diesel and gasoline trucks. Now, once that happened, then it would become reasonable and economically feasible for the private sector to start making the switch from diesel-powered trucks to electric-powered trucks. So if the federal government and the state governments following suit made a shift to green procurement, that could do more than any set of subsidies and rigmarole little experiments to facilitate, to help, nurture the clean sector. And so, that can happen, and it doesn't require that Congress appoint more money. It doesn't require the permission of the Republicans. It's something that can happen. The federal government is going to spend money on all of this stuff. It might as well direct it, towards electric vehicles, towards clean power. I mean, the post office alone has 140,000 vehicles, the average one of which drive only 18 miles a day, park in the same place. There's absolutely no reason that they shouldn't all be electric. And if that happened, that would drive down the price of electric vehicles, and it would be reasonable for other, sectors of the economy to start adopting it. So I end on that positive note, not because I necessarily think it's going to happen, but to basically save my readers from total despair. Because it's clear we have the technology, we have the capital, and it's just a matter of the political will, and we can start making changes immediately. So I should probably open it to I should probably open it up to questions. But I know that some of you are interested in this question about the limits of capitalism and its relationship to nature, and that's one thing I deal with at the end of the book. And I acknowledge that there may, in fact, as Marx and Engels said, be a metabolic rift, that capitalism can grow forever, the planet is finite. So is capitalism compatible with the Earth? Probably not. That's different than the whole issue of climate change. And I think sometimes we confuse all of the environmental problems with climate change because the implications for climate change, if unchecked, are so catastrophic that it can look like all of these other things together. But what I argue for is pulling climate change out, viewing it as a subset, and viewing it as an emergency that has to be dealt with in a reformist and pragmatic fashion now, not because that will save and transform the world, but it will merely buy us time to deal with all the other problems that we have to deal with. And that if we don't address the compressed time frame that is implied by climate science, we're going to tip over the edge into a runaway climate change. And I failed to say, but I assume all of you know that obviously the science indicates that there are tipping points after 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. It might be higher, who knows, might be lower. We're now at 390 parts of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the implications of that science suggest to me that we don't have time to wait to transform all of social relations so as to transform how we produce energy. That we have to transform how we produce energy in the short term, or we will never have the time to address all of the other environmental and social problems that are rooted in capitalism. So on that note, I will open it up for your questions, or how are we going to do this?
I think Ben West was going to join us up here and share some thoughts and initiate some questions, right?
I didn't realize I was coming down here to talk. I guess first of all, I just want to say it's so great to have a chance to hear you talk. I for one was really eager to see this talk happen. As a member of this kind of new Green Left book club, I see the connection between social movements being made to be a really critical thing. This is a book I think that looks at a set of issues that are sort of important to two very divergent, different sort of social movements. And really brings a lot of those people together. And I'm not sure if that was a sort of explicit goal or just sort of a happy sort of reality that comes as a result of it. But I mean, I think creating a situation where you get people who are worried about social justice issues and people who are primarily motivated by environmental issues, and of course there's lots of overlap. But there are many people who are sort of much more focused on one or the other, and to sort of see the links and the connections between those two realms. I personally think is very important. So, I think your book does quite a service to sort of create that dialogue, and I guess I just want to thank you for that. In terms of a question, well, I guess as a starting point, you ended on sort of a positive note, and being the sort of grumpy environmentalist from British Columbia that I am, I feel the need to take all the wind right out of the sails of the positive. Talking about the carbon neutral government that we've got here in British Columbia, it's an unfortunate reality that we sort of on the surface have made this sort of presentation that the government of British Columbia has said, all of our government's going to be carbon neutral. In fact, by next year, all of the public sector is supposed to be carbon neutral, which sounds fantastic. The problem is, of course, that when a right-wing government takes over, any set of sort of policies, they have a way of making it serve the interests of corporations first and foremost. And what we've seen in BC is actually that, just to use the Vancouver School Board as one example, the Vancouver School Board put up, $700,000 last year in carbon offset credits that they had to purchase simply because they had no new money to, replace boilers or to, fix the old buses or whatever it might be. And instead they were basically forced to buy offsets. In fact, some of those offsets are even coming from a company, Offsetter, which was the official offset regime for the Olympics and others that's now owned by Ledcor, which for anybody who knows that company, it's just beyond the pale to even think that somehow is a good idea. But now the majority of those offset credits are actually going to some of the biggest corporations in the province, and many of them the biggest sources of greenhouse gases. So, without getting too into the technicalities of kind of what's going on in BC, and I guess I'm just sort of bringing up some of the stuff that can be done to pervert even the best of intentions. I'm not putting that on you in any way, of course, but I just felt the need to sort of say that because here we are in BC with something that sounds like a very good sort of policy position that's very much like what was being presented, and unfortunately the end result of it has been anything but what it really should be. I mean, I for one don't even really see demonstrable reductions in greenhouse gases in British Columbia as a result of it.
I mean, offsets are a total joke.
Yeah.
None of them ever work. I mean, that cannot be how it works.
And unfortunately, that's pretty much exactly what's going on in BC. And to say nothing of if you want to delve deeper into it, look to the work that some of the folks from the CCP have done around offsets in BC with the Pacific Carbon Trust scandals and stuff. It's not a pretty picture. So actually the first question I wanted to ask, though, is almost completely unrelated to what I just said. I just couldn't help myself. Yesterday we held this pretty amazing public forum. The First Nations of British Columbia have 130 nations in Western Canada have signed a declaration called the Save the Fraser Declaration, which ostensibly bans the export of tar sands oil through the west coast of Canada. Using Indigenous law as its primary motivating sort of basis of sort of legal framework. And I guess I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of the role of sort of anti-colonial or sort of Indigenous struggles for sovereignty and sovereignty rights as it relates to this kind of fight against the causes of climate change. Like an example, Bolivia, the Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, I think, is a pretty exciting thing that's happening. And it seems to me, anyway, and I'm just curious because I think your sort of understanding of what's going on around the world is pretty extensive. I'm curious if you see that as sort of a hopeful pushback against sort of corporate control and corporate power being the sort of Indigenous struggles that are happening worldwide.
Yeah, I do. I mean, what you just described is that's very heartening about its opposition to the pipeline. And it's clear in Bolivia that the old ways of life and worldviews were the basis upon which social movements developed that were capable of taking state power. Now, as for Evo Morales' declaration about the rights of, Pachamama, there's also the risk with that kind of politics of romanticism and a kind of romantic racism that can creep in where thinking stops. And so Evo Morales is indigenous and, he's declared the rights of Mother Earth and, end of discussion. It's like, but, Bolivia is totally dependent on natural gas. And that's not to blame Bolivia. I mean, I do not expect, it's not reasonable to think that Bolivia would say, we're going to stop, producing and exporting natural gas to Brazil, and we're just going to let the people go hungry. I mean, that's unrealistic. But we have to have discussions that are sophisticated about these things, and I think that sometimes doesn't happen. But I'm very heartened, and I have seen a lot of throughout the world where social movements are effective. Particularly Latin America is the place where they're most effective these days. And what you're talking about is this, indigenous life ways are crucial in producing the solidarity that carries these movements forward over the long haul. What will become of Bolivia now that there is a socialist government remains to be seen. And I mean, for one thing, I say this as a friend, so I have tremendous respect for Evo Morales, for the movements that put him in power. But the fact of the matter is the revolution there is unfortunately suffering all of the things that resource states suffer: corruption, incompetence. I asked the ambassador Pablo Salon, who endorsed my book very kindly, what was up with the development of the lithium. There's huge lithium salt deposits in Bolivia, and they want to try and develop this so that they can move away from oil and into battery technology. And it's not happening because the state isn't organized enough to make it happen. And so I think there's a lot of difficult discussions that activists need to have that we are kind of trained to shy away from because it's rude to criticize our friends. And we have to come up with a way of doing that before it's too late. And this is something also I noticed when I was coming of age politically as an activist around Central America, it seemed like the left had two positions only. It was either you loved the revolutions and they were the greatest thing that ever happened, or you had been disabused and you'd seen the light and Daniel Ortega is a thug and the Sandinistas are sellouts, blah, blah, blah. And there was no position in between, which was like, okay, these are movements inhabited by people, you know, some of whom, like Daniel Ortega, carry like intense trauma. It's not going to be this romantic thing. And can't there be a way of having critical engagement before? Because, in other words, romanticism is the setup for disillusionment. And so that, I think, is something that is crucial to building a new type of international solidarity, because the last round of it suffered from that. I've kind of gone beyond the implications of your question.
No, that's great. I mean, I guess maybe if I'm trying to flesh out what I was getting at with my question, and perhaps Bolivia is not the right example of it, is sort of the role of self-control over resources and sort of getting towards sort of something that could resemble sustainability, and the distinction between the sort of imposition of colonial or corporate takeovers of states versus the indigenous people of countries sort of taking back control of their state resources and perhaps at least taking steps towards what could be described as sustainable.
Yeah, I think that's crucial in the way, both in blocking the development of stuff like the tar sands, and then in terms of building on new, sustainable resources and the new technologies that will be needed to, harness them, like, non-destructive tidal and hydrokinetic power and that sort of stuff. But yeah, the local control is essential for defeating what we face now and hopefully building something different that can be sustainable in a real sense. But I also do think that that there is a role for the state, and that we need to rethink the state and recognize that the state is an asset potentially, and it's not just government is not just jails and border cops and corporate subsidies. It's also all of the other progressive features that are under attack by neoliberalism, and we need to develop movements that can articulate ways to defend and develop the commons that are protected by the state, and I think that's happening. But sometimes the local, the argument for the local can slip into a kind of anti-statist position that I find highly problematic. And again, I think there's this risk of romanticism around some of like the idea that after the collapse we'll all be living in nice little self-organized New England towns and going to town meeting and growing our own food. Maybe not. Maybe localism in the face of crisis looks like localism in Afghanistan, where it's like that valley's run by this warlord, that valley's run by the other warlord. That's the type of local community politics that is not democratic, but is imbued with local sensibilities and localist politics.
I guess if I was going to introduce anything else into the discussion, I was particularly interested in the sort of relationship between oil resources and conflict. And I mean, often when we talk about sort of wars for oil, we kind of forget about the amount of oil that it takes to fight wars. And as the major supplier to the United States here in Canada with our oil sands, one thing that I've been thinking about a bit more, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on this, is the role that we can actually play in limiting the fuel that's needed to actually make the war possible. We're at a major choke point of oil getting off the oil sands and across the Pacific coast right here in Vancouver. This is where I get to plug what I'm working on. Mm-hmm. There's 2 oil tankers a week moving through the Burrard Inlet right now carrying oil sands oil, and there's a plan to get up to about 280 tankers annually. In fact, we just had an increase of about 10 annually yesterday. In terms of the legislation that allowed it. And this is a major choke point. The Enbridge pipeline's another one, the Keystone pipeline's another one. Each one of those would basically increase the size of the oil sands by about 30%. And the pipeline that goes from the oil sands into Vancouver also cuts off and goes down to the BP refinery in Washington, which of course serves a major military installation. So I wonder if if there's much thinking that's going on looking at sort of the role of reducing the demand for fossil fuel, not just in terms of taking away the sort of push for those conflicts. And I'm not sure that you can so clearly make those links, because I think there's a lot of other reasons the wars are going on beyond the oil, of course. But I just in terms of a strategy and sort of another way to make the links between environmental movements and social justice movements, that's something that's becoming, I think, a more interesting thing to explore, at least in terms of our relationship between Canada and the United States.
Yeah. You find yourselves, you guys in Canada find yourself in a very strategic position, and you could do a lot for the whole world by choking off that oil. I mean, that will force the development of alternative fuels, which is not the solution to all problems, but that would be a good thing. In terms of the military and its access to fuel, I mean, it's already investing heavily in clean technology, because the price of moving fuel to these forward operating bases in Afghanistan, they did a study, and the average gallon of fuel costs between $400 and $300 to get out to these places. So it's not that the Pentagon is bereft of money, but it hampers their capacity a little bit, and so for all the wrong reasons, they want to basically green up their act a little bit so that they're more mobile. They want to cut their fossil fuel tether so that they can, operate this campaign, this open-ended global scale campaign of counterterror and counterinsurgency. So that's the main connection I see between the military and fuel, other than the obvious thing that the U.S. military is about guarding fuel sources. And I mean, I think the main connection between oil and the wars, which I wrote about in The Freedom to some extent, that there is obviously a connection. I mean, it was definitely about oil, but it wasn't about grabbing Iraq's oil to put in U.S. gas tanks. It was about situating the U.S. military as the central force that guards one of the world's crucial fuel sources. I mean, if that had worked out, or if it works out to the extent that they want it, I mean, that is a major move on the global chessboard for the United States. Europe and China heavily dependent on Caspian and Middle Eastern oil. If the U.S. can establish its military presence on the shipping lanes and in the region as the security guarantor, that has all sorts of geopolitical implications for the U.S. That means when you're lining up votes in the UN for whatever it is, everyone is that much more dependent on you. That means that any kind of independent direction and policy coming out of the other centers of world capitalism are going to be rethought just a little bit more because of this dependency on U.S. militarism as the fuel gendarme. And I think it's pretty clearly an attempt to reestablish a role for the U.S. military that it had during the Cold War. And this is relying on the work of Peter Gowan, who passed away, but wrote brilliantly about the end of the Cold War. And one of the leverage points that the U.S. had over its friends, we forget in the Cold War that there's also a lot of conflict between allies, and the U.S. was trying to keep in check the Soviet Union and defeat socialist revolution wherever it could, but it was also always trying to maintain control over its allies. And one key way it did that was with this atomic arsenal and creating this military dependence through NATO and stuff like other, sometimes just bilateral connections on its military umbrella. And I think that with the end of the Cold War, for some of these right-wing geostrategic thinkers, they were really worried about how do we get the world system, the world political order, to recenter on American military power? I mean, how are they dependent on us? And they're not. And that the war in Iraq was about reestablishing that. And of course, Cheney also, said, "Would you guys like to divide this up?" In the end, they were bested by the Iraqis. The Iraqi Shia said, "We want elections." Paul Bremer, as you guys will recall, said, No. You can't have elections. We're going to have an appointed government. The Shia said, "Well, we're going to hit the streets." And suddenly, out of nowhere, came, hundreds of thousands of people in January 2004, just suddenly, Shia everywhere. And they said, "We want an election." And so the U.S. was forced to have these elections. The Shia sweep the elections. There's then the civil war. The Sunni are defeated in this horrible, bloody civil war, and they finally realize that now the Shiite parties dominate Iraq. And they, they did not allow the U.S. to shape the oil law. And when the oil law was finally passed and the contracts were given out, the U.S. did not get a lot of the contracts. The Russians, the Chinese, the Italians did much better than the U.S. But I see Jeff Dirksen rising to his feet. So.
I'll make one final thank you comment, which was, as a climate campaigner, you deal with a lot of climate change deniers, and the references that you make in your book, I think the most sort of practical day-to-day thing that's been useful for me from your book is the references to the reports on climate change and the threat of climate change from various military organizations around the world. And if you bring up, disagreeing with a military report to somebody on the right, it's like their head basically explodes.
That's good to know.
Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for saying that.
Thanks a lot, Ben, and thanks to the Green Left Book Club for their close reading of Christian's book and generating this discussion. But I do want to open it up for anyone who has a question. If you're comfortable, come and use the microphone at the front.
Yeah, I have a question about your conclusions on the book, where you talked about that the solutions have to be reformist and pragmatic. But the thing is that the reformists, which in this country means the New Democratic Party, their interest is in compromising with capital, and in doing so they have no interest in actually overcoming any of the problems dealing with climate change, because they have no interest in shutting down the tar sands. And when you do something like shutting down the tar sands, which is what it would take really in this country to start really dealing with our greenhouse gas emissions, you've made a significant challenge to capitalism, and the reformists have no interest in doing that, and therefore I wonder how you can stand by your conclusions when the reformists have no interest in doing anything about what's going on, and certainly the capitalists have no interest in doing it because they need to generate more capital at a time, and they do that by just spewing out more greenhouse gases. And so, yeah, I'm wondering where you come down on all of that.
Well, I didn't actually say we should cooperate with reformists. I said my position is on the question of the limits of capitalism, the natural limits of capitalism. I'm arguing for, in the face of climate change, taking a reformist position. That I do not think the solution, I do not think a realistic solution for cutting greenhouse gas emissions is socialist revolution or anarchist revolution or some sort of neo-primitive revolution or some sort of green Norman Rockwell localist revolution, because I don't think any of that's going to happen in the time frame necessary. So what I'm talking about is not reformist politics. I mean, I think there has to be direct action. There has to be mass movements. But that we have to be realistic about, like, okay, if we are going to meet the goals that the climate science says we must, we need lots and lots of investment and lots of technology, you know? And how, realistically, how's that going to happen? I mean, who's going to do this? Occupied Wall Street? I mean, what? Really? I mean, seriously. I mean, if we're going to build out a new energy infrastructure, how is that going to happen? It's going to be capitalist firms. It's either going to be capitalist firms start doing it now, or it's not going to happen. I mean, because I just don't see how the time frame works. That we wait, what? How long does the change take? I mean, we're at the tipping point right now. You know, it's very well might be too late already. I mean, that's what they're saying out of Durban. They're saying it's probably impossible to cut greenhouse gas emissions in any way that will forestall an increase of 2 degrees Celsius. Once that starts happening, then the feedback loops could really kick in, and then climate change, global warming is being propelled not by processes rooted in civilization of burning fossil fuels, but release of the methane in the Arctic, release of carbon from dying forests, and it'll be very hard for civilization to cope or control that. So I'm just trying to be realistic about this one specific problem. And it's not, just to repeat, it's not the same as the environmental crisis. So I've tried to treat climate change the same way we have treated like clean air and clean water in more local contexts. I mean, capital has never dealt with this. Capital doesn't have it in its capacity. Capitalist societies, which have states that are influenced not just by the will of capital and businesses, but by people and social movements, have time and time again imposed limits on capitalism. And that's the only reason that the system is able to continue, is that there is a state which says, no, here you may not go. You know, you cannot invest in that. You cannot dump your filth into the water here. And we've cleaned up the air a bit, not enough. We cleaned up water through legal intervention by the state, being pressured by social movements. So I think that's what we're looking at in terms of trying to make this shift away from fossil fuels in really beginning immediately, and doing it in the next 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, to say it just sounds insane. You realize we're basically probably not going to do it. We're going to just sail off the edge of the cliff. But I'm just trying to be realistic. And I know that it sounds very, it's abrasive to the ears of many people on the left who don't like not being pious, essentially. And yes, I'm admitting a certain type of pragmatic surrender to some of the enemies, but I'm trying to be really realistic about the nature of this problem.
Okay, thanks for that.
The book sounds very solid, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm wondering, what are you learning from how people are responding to the book?
That's a very interesting question. Thanks for that. What am I learning? I'm learning that what am I learning? I'm learning that that there is this issue about the state that is, I think, really central to our politics, that people are really uncomfortable discussing what the state is and what it means. And I think that's the main lesson, that I've come away with, is that that's something that I'm increasingly addressing myself to thinking about and talking with people about. And I mean, I've also learned that, all the kind of, good stuff. There's a lot of people committed to making this happen, making this shift happen, and people take this very seriously. But I guess that's the main thing I've learned, is that we are not really up to the task of thinking about the state in the face of this crisis and what it means and how we should relate to it.
Yeah, right. And so I'd like to say, I don't know, as a Canadian, I don't know how this is going to work at stopping global warming without everybody on the planet ganging up on the United States as the biggest offender.
Go right ahead.
As a Canadian, I'd like to challenge any green person in Canada to tell me why we should save energy, why Canadians should be asked to conserve energy when we're going to turn around and export it to the United States or to the satanic mills in China. Different nationalisms coming up. The Chinese saying, well, our per capita, we might be the biggest emitter, but our per capita
Very low, yeah.
is low, third world level low per capita in China. And the Chinese are going to say, on top of that, a great percentage of the energy that we consume in China is to produce goods that you in the West, the United States, and other places consume.
Mm-hmm. Carbon leakage, they call that.
So, well, yeah, and that doesn't get. I don't see that. I'm kind of a global warming dummy. Not about the argument, but as far as the Kyoto stuff, I don't think we've done a good job on explaining that to people. How do you count somebody's mercantilism? They're going to say, well, exclude our mercantilism because you consume those goods. And other people are going to say, hopefully, Canadians are going to say, well, what? I'm going to say I'm a reactionary. What Canadian reactionary? Why should I conserve energy so that some Americans?
Right. Well, I guess the only reasonable answer would be that if we are going to make it, it is going to require that Canadians also make the transition. I mean, if we don't make it, you're right. But if we do make it, then it requires that everybody does transform. First of all, reduce the amount of energy we use, and then transform where we get it from. And I think you're right about the U.S. The U.S. plays an absolutely central role in this. Totally important. I mean, and the fact that Obama turned his back essentially on the Kyoto process. I mean, the Copenhagen, the process to create a successor agreement. I think that's what killed it fundamentally. That Obama had taken that seriously, we'd be in a very different situation. We'd probably be in a situation where we'd be passing, or we would have passed a successor agreement that was totally ineffective, but would have been something to build off of. But now we're having the total breakdown of the international process around dealing with this. And that, I think, is really bad, because one thing that the Global South and activists have pushed for, and should and probably would be part of a new treaty internationally, would be a fund to transfer capital and technology from the North to the South. And that's essential for helping developing economies to both mitigate their emissions and adapt to the amount of climate change we're locked in for. So it's a disaster that the Kyoto, the UNFCCC process around the treaties has collapsed, and it is fundamentally, you're right, the U.S.'s fault.
Debates between states, arguing different states are different.
Yeah.
And finally, just to follow up, I don't know how we're going to transfer technology without getting rid of patents.
Like getting rid of what?
Getting rid of
Patents.
Patents.
And that goes back to one of the pillars of capitalism.
Right.
Capitalism.
Yeah. It's definitely. These reforms are pushing back against capital. To make the transition away from fossil fuels would be to euthanize the most powerful sector in the capitalist economy globally, the oil industry. Which is almost an impossible task if you think about it. But yeah, it would certainly, damage a key part of capitalism, but it wouldn't overthrow the system necessarily. One thing, though, about China, China is very interesting. I'm very hopeful about China in certain ways. It's really interesting what China has done about clean energy. Due to local air pollution, the Chinese have been forced to clean up dirty power plants, and they have invested heavily in solar and wind, and those two sectors are growing enormously fast in China. And they've done it the old-fashioned way. They did it the same way the U.S. developed its textile industry. We sent a guy named Lowell to England, who was an industrial spy. He worked in the mills, and he memorized how to make the looms. And they searched him twice when he left England. He came to the U.S., and they built these looms, and out of that comes the rise of the American textile industry. Chinese invited in Gamesa, Vestas, GE, all the big wind turbine manufacturers. And wind turbines, for those of you who don't know or have never tried to research this, it's like trying to research military technology. I naively thought I was going to get tours of wind turbine factories, and I'd be like, asking all these companies, and no way they will let you anywhere near that technology. So the Chinese invite these firms in. They steal the technology. They set up their own companies with subsidized credit, like Goldwind, and they're just growing, enormously, and they're beginning to export this stuff. And they have told the major Western firms, they say, look, you can stay on board, and you can have, each of you can have 2% of a market that's growing at about 20% or more a year, or you can sue us, whatever you want, take it or leave it. And they've been like, okay, I think we'll stick with this, and that's really hopeful in a way, because if developing economies are going to make the choice not to build coal and gas plants, but to build solar plants and wind farms, it's going to be with Chinese technology when that stuff is cheap enough and available.
We have three other questions. So the man sitting in the middle, do you mind using the mic just because then it goes on the video? Or I think it was the guy behind you, though, first. Sorry. Am I correct? Everyone will
One
get
of
a
you.
turn, so.
So what I'm wondering is that we have, sort of two movements that are tied into your book, where we have like anti-war and social justice issues, and then we have environmental issues. And as an activist who's sort of worked on both campaigns, but worked mostly on anti-war, what really inspires me about the book is how it so ties it all together. And I see that with the environmental movement, there's a lot more funding, a lot more NGOs and established organizations, whereas anti-war work tends to be like local activists who fundraise out of their own pockets and don't have very much. How can we tie these together? When even on some simple reforms that could be done to make a big difference would be take away from military spending. Like our government is spending billions of dollars building fighter jets that could be easily applied towards building public transportation and solar panels. So how can we bring those together to make a movement that can really have an impact?
Well, I'm not a student of or a scholar of social movements, and I mean those are really the key questions in many ways, and I'm not that good at understanding that stuff. So I wish I knew how to bring these movements together and how to make social movements more effective, but I don't. One thing I would say from the American context is that I think organized labor is central to, at least in the history of the American left. I don't really know the history of the Canadian left well enough, but organized labor has always been central in our movements in ways that are not always recognized. And organized labor in the U.S. is now in a very bad way, and its leadership is, by and large, pretty unimaginative. They don't take ideas seriously. In many cases, they don't take organizing that seriously. They don't take climate change seriously. And they didn't really take the green jobs agenda seriously. But I think organized labor is a key point of leverage, that the left needs to renovate organized labor, and that there isn't going to be a sustainable revival of the U.S. left if organized labor isn't revitalized. And climate change would be one area where militarism and jobs and addressing climate change could come together through the work of labor unions in helping to push this transition. So that's one. I guess that's like the only thing I think that I don't hear other people saying enough that I could say about these social movement building things. That labor is a key place to get involved, and that these moribund organizations have a lot of money and a lot of potential, and they need to be revitalized because they have been really important in the past, and they can be again.
Sir, did you have a question?
I suspect that the Canadian unions are more robust. Yeah.
Still over 30%. Percentage-wise.
Still over 30%. Wow. We're at yeah, in the private sector, it's union density of 8%.
You said that it was difficult to think the state's role. That was one of the things that had come up to you as a major problem. My read of the states is that thinking the state in the United States is an exceptionally difficult predicament, and that is not the same in Europe. Europeans seem to understand that the state oversees social production and reproduction in very broad terms, and that is very hard to speak in America. So you're always fighting a losing battle about what is the state there to do. France, nuclear power, the state jumps in there straight away. So these big projects, interventions by the state, are blocked by how America thinks the state and its people. So I do agree with you, and I'm not surprised as an American that comes out as a sort of predicament, how to unblock your what you're trying to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is particularly hard to rethink the state in the U.S. and part of that has to do with the weird division of powers we have. It's the three branches of government: the state and the federal. It was designed by the founding fathers to diffuse opposition. Madison, in the Federalist Papers, explains very clearly the problem of faction and class struggle, essentially, and makes the case in Federalist 51 that this Constitution basically creates a government that's so decentralized that nobody can ever really take it over. And that's one of the key problems in thinking about the state, is that people, the left has had a hard time getting hold of the state. And so we turn against it. And then, of course, there's this deep anti-statist ideology within the U.S. that's rooted in slavery and the tradition of the southern states to assert states' rights, which was always about slavery. They were always afraid that the federal government was going to impinge on the rights of slave owners, and out of that comes this ethos of small government, and it carries on after slavery, obviously, but it is also very much rooted in that geography of the Old South and the Sun Belt. So, yeah, we have a lot of problems around that and other things in the U.S.
Thanks for your talk. I agree with much of what you say. You mentioned we have the technology and we have the resources, and it appears to me as it being a political problem. We need to seize power, as you just mentioned. This is why it takes a little bit of issue of being critical of other people on our side, because our enemy is big enough, and I think it does us no good disenfranchising other people or becoming too desperate and working with governments, non-traditional governments, or corporations, because here in BC, the environmental movement went all crazy because we added a carbon tax on gasoline, and they added no alternatives for people to take transit, but they just jacked up the taxes, and people got all excited about that. Well, a lot of people couldn't afford to drive their cars anymore. So this is one example. Another example is if you just rely on the corporate sector to get it done, we'll have a few more Honda Prius, but we won't have the massive change that we need. So I wonder if you want to maybe kind of readdress some of these issues, because I think we need to seize power, and I think the Occupy movements, it's really hard to want to work with someone when they use state violence against you, and when we see it in the news, what happens when people... So I think there needs to be, instead of criticizing Bolivia, look at how they organize their social movements, how they seize state power, because it may not be perfect, but it's better than hoping Toyota will make more hybrid cars.
Well, yeah, first of all, I'm not hoping that Toyota will make more hybrid cars. I mean, I talk precisely about how to use the state, that the state has to use these huge resources it has, and not to have market mechanisms get capitalism to do this, but, for the state to use its resources to decide how it's going to buy stuff. That moves markets. In terms of criticizing Bolivia, maybe you didn't understand me. I support Bolivia tremendously, and I'm a huge fan of them. And I am worried that those who romanticize Bolivia will find out what any adult should have known all along, which is that there's going to be a lot of corruption and a lot of incompetence. The others, like the engineers in Bolivia, are on the other side. They're racist, a lot of them. They're light-skinned, middle-class professionals. They've studied in the U.S. They don't want to work with, Indians and communists, socialists, whatever this is. So they've abandoned the state. That causes real problems. And what I'm worried about is seeing a repeat of what happened around Central America. It's like, I'm not saying, we should criticize, blah, 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 to get to some perfect thing. No, but to recognize that, nobody's perfect, no movement is perfect, and no government is perfect. And how do we support these compromised, imperfect movements and states, especially when they take state power, as they have in Bolivia? And then it becomes really, even harder. And that's where the corruption kicks in, because there are all these public resources. And so my fear, my desire is not to get people to criticize Bolivia, but just to not have people be blinkered about what's going on and then suddenly realize it and then be outraged and turn their back on this and say, see what happens when you try and take state power, And I don't know what the proper mix is, but I'm just advocating for kind of sober sensibility about what's really going on, so that we don't get disappointed and turn our backs on our friends. And in terms of, this is another thing that happens. I'm not talking about, offsets are useless. I'm not talking about market mechanisms. I'm talking about capitalism as a society with the state at the center of it, saying to capital, as it has always, all the way along. The fact of the matter is no capitalist economy has ever developed without the state simultaneously supporting and subsidizing capital and also disciplining and containing it. There is always industrial policy, whether it is acknowledged or not. And the history of the United States is that we have this kind of secret industrial policy, which is our military policy. But that's that's where iPhones come from. The latest thing, Siri on the iPhone 4, that's directly from public spending in the Defense Department. But we don't acknowledge it as economic policy, that we're going to invest in developing technologies. It's just about fighting communism, and then massive resources go into that. But that's what it was during the Cold War.
So I'll take two more questions, one from him, then the woman up
This
there.
might sound facile and conspiratorial. That's okay. I don't mind looking a little bit stupid. Gaddafi and Hussein, they both talked vociferously about unpegging from the petrodollar. And it just seems to me that one of the potential impediments to the U.S. facilitating migration away from an oil economy is the fact that because of the petrodollar, because OPEC oil is pegged to the American dollar, the salubriousness of the American economy, it's pegged to the vitality of this economy.
Mm-hmm.
So if the vitality of the dollar is pegged to the vitality of the oil economy, how can you expect the American government to facilitate migrating away from that model?
That's true. I mean, I think you lay out. What you said didn't sound that conspiratorial. I mean, you're right. The vitality of the U.S. economy is why the U.S. Dollar is, and dollar-denominated assets are the place to go during a storm. They're the safe investment. And you're right that oil is denominated in dollars is part of that, but it's not as crucial as the vitality of the U.S. economy. I mean, the reason that investors flee into dollar-denominated assets, even when they basically earn nothing at all, because interest rates are so low, is because there's this faith that the largest economy in the world with this powerful state isn't going to default. And so I think it has less to do with oil, that if oil is denominated in different currencies, that's not going to undermine the centrality of the dollar as much as you might be suggesting. But I think the main reason that the U.S. government isn't willing to move away from fossil fuels is just because the fossil fuel industry is very well organized and has for 100 years been learning how to relate to government, learning how to repress trade unions and local movements in the U.S. and abroad that don't want their forests or mountains or homes destroyed by the process. I mean, they've had 100 years to learn how to play politics, and they're very good at it. And the U.S. state is deeply intertwined with those corporate interests. That, I think, is the main reason.
Thanks. And our final question. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I feel slightly confused, and so I guess I'm asking for kind of a clarification. Because on the one hand, you're emphasizing the urgency of the situation. It requires our immediate attention. And on the other hand, you've acknowledged that, the political institutions that are currently in place, both in the U.S. and in Canada, I think are inherently conservative and unable in some ways to deal with issues that require drastic attention, in the sense that, so my question is, where is the political will going to come from, if not from, radical social movements that may have a specific,
that's where it comes from,
specific, reformist or a concrete action in mind. And because I see a lot of potential in the Occupy movement, and I think that it is just one way that we could draw attention to these issues, because I don't see the political will coming from within the establishment right now, because of the way that the power structure is all embedded right now. So if you could just maybe clarify.
So, it's not, it's that it's, the political class is unwilling. It's not unable, The law is already there. They could euthanize the oil industry tomorrow. The EPA could just say, this is the price of carbon, Like, invent some way to make burning coal totally clean, or shut the coal plant and invest in something else. They could do that. The law's on the books. They need to be pressured by movements. Absolutely. I hope I was clear about that. I pin all my hopes on social movements. That's what my comments about labor unions were. When I said who's gonna develop this, Occupied Wall Street, I mean literally, like, who's gonna build thousands of high-tech, heavy industry windmills? Who's going to do that? I mean, it's not going to be social movements. Social movements can create the crisis and build the pressure that forces the political class to finally turn away from coal and oil and embrace the policies that will help build out this new energy infrastructure. But that new energy infrastructure is, and this is a point that people skirt around sometimes, but let's just say it, it's going to be done by capitalists. It's going to be businesses that exploit people's labor for a profit. That's who builds windmills. That's who builds solar panels. They're capitalist firms out to make a profit. And I'm not in favor of that. I'm just like, let's be realistic about if there was to be a transition beginning now, happening, actually happening in 10, 20, 30 years, it's going to be these institutions. It's going to be these governments, and it's going to be these economic institutions, corporations. That doesn't mean I like this set of arrangements. I'm not now arguing for this. I don't think the reason I'm trying to be pragmatic and realistic about this is because I don't see a revolutionary alternative at the door, about to push down the door and nationalize all industry and, have workers' councils running it. And, maybe that'll happen. But I don't think it's going to happen. What was that? Not yet. And hopefully the transition could, provide platforms for that, the working class becomes organized to demand this transition, and in this transition gets more and more control, and there's greater distribution of wealth, and there's more popular and public control over private capital. It doesn't just have to be the abolition of private capitalism, of privately held capital. There's useful things happen when control, popular and public control, is placed on private firms and money is directed towards popular needs. So that's the reformist position I'm talking about. And it's not because I think it's better than other things. It's just because I think that 350 parts per million in the atmosphere is a deadline we have to take seriously.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you guys for coming out on a Friday night.